All right. Hello there. I'm Bruce Clarke at Texas Tech University. Happy to be with you today. My lecture today is called Gaian Futurities, Beyond the Phoenix Complex to the Domains of the Infra-Human. Now, for this talk, I've been asked to envision some form of future cybernetics, one that we may wish to hasten into existence by our own present speculations upon its virtual possibility. This hopeful cybernetics to come should counter or inoculate against systemic pathologies inducing unjust social regimentation, corporate exploitation, political violence, or environmental degradation. It should promote freedom and democracy, respect for natural rights, and ontological diversity, and the pursuit of beauty, pleasure, and creativity. So for assistance with this tall measure, I have implored the geobiosphere for wisdom regarding the foundations of our living world in a mode of natural technicity that has come to be called Gaia. Conceived as a system, or in an updated idiom, as a form of cosmotechnics, Gaia names the idea that living beings, taken together with the world-making they perform as they evolve in relation to their solar and terrestrial environments, have organized the planet so as to maintain its habitability over geological time. What then may this Gaia's past and present states have to tell us about Gaian futurities for ecological and cultural flourishing? Now, a focus on Gaia embeds the cybernetic theme, as it were, organically or geobiologically within the requested meditation upon the future of the human technosphere. It connects this discussion to our expectations one may attach to the concept of Gaia, as that came forward in the later 20th century in the collaborative work of the British chemist James Lovelock and the American biologist Lynn Margulis, seen here around 1983. Beginning in the 1960s, Lovelock presented Gaia as a, quote, biological cybernetic system. Lovelock and Margulis originally conceived Gaia as a planetary system observing first-order cybernetic principles of homeostasis, negative feedback, and self-regulation. The second-order cybernetics, formally codified by Heinz von Foerster in the 1970s and made concrete in Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela's concept of biological autopoiesis, pressed the analysis of recursive processes beyond mechanical and computational control regimes toward natural systems, operational autonomy, and self-maintenance. And at the end of the 1980s, Margulis and Lovelock reiterated the first-order biological cybernetics of the Gaia concept in relation to this second-order or autopoietic redescription in terms of the biosphere's contingent autonomy or operational self-reference. And they wrote, while cybernetic systems are steered by some external agency, biological cybernetic systems are steered from the inside. The Gaia hypothesis postulates a planet with the biota actively engaged in environmental regulation and control on its own behalf. Now, alongside Gaia's more recent mainstreaming in the scientific academy as Earth system science, other precincts of academia have seen a continuing interest in the Gaia debate. A host of prominent thinkers in the critical and environmental, social sciences, and humanities, including Bruno Latour, Isabel Stengers, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Donna Haraway, and Amitav Ghosh, have addressed Gaia in a major key and specifically as a theme fit to challenge the destructive legacies of Western modernity. Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveros de Castro put this trend well and succinctly in their critical anthropology of contemporary visions of apocalypse, The Ends of the World, which text builds to a chapter titled Humans and Terrans in the Gaia War. They write in their conclusion, the name of Gaia is an anti-modernist provocation. The implication here is that the unfolding of organic or Gaian cybernetics in particular has been covertly subversive of the reductionist and physicalist modern scientific program that set it forth. Responding to Bruno Latour's evocation of the Terrans, that is, the resistant multitudes who must outlive and so replace modernist humans who have wrought the worst degradations upon the Anthropocene biosphere, Danowski and Viveros de Castro affirm that what we still need to work out is who is the demos of Gaia, the people that this entity gathers and convokes, and who their enemy is. In The Ends of the World, this idea of a Gaia war reflects our precarious present state. And in K. Alado McDowell's Air Age Blueprint, a text I will return to later in this talk, a shadowy character confronts the narrator with a related declaration saying, in case you haven't noticed, we are in a cybernetic war for the future of the planet. How then do we bring the Gaia war to an end? Or at least to a state of truce that allows for the non-warring coexistence of diverse living beings? When the Gaia war is over, what forms will future Terrans take? Or perhaps better, how will the future Terrans fit themselves to a Gaian technosphere into which AI affordances have been pervasively absorbed? Danowski and Viveros de Castro largely sidestep the technological issue by evoking a slow society re-becoming indigenous, modeled on Amerindian collectives as a, quote, figuration of the future, not a remnant of the past, masters of techno-primitivist bricolage and politico-metaphysical metamorphosis. They are one of the possible chances, in fact, of a subsistence of the future, unquote. Alternatively, Air Age Blueprint explicitly turns Viveros de Castro's anthropological insights otherwise, in the cybernetic direction of interspecies communication mediated by AI intercessors, bringing living, quote, entities into communication, which reveals them to be subjects like us, in other words, secretly human. This secret humanity is the foundation of the Amerindian cosmology, unquote. Viveros de Castro has called this inner consistency across species Amerindian perspectivism. Alado McDowell calls this cybernetic animism. His future vision binds biotic and metabiotic objects through a perspectivist construction of a Terran form of the post-human in which Gaia's natural technicity, as humanly redesigned and reinvented for the sake of a detoxified technosphere, becomes the ground of a newly planetary indigeneity, enfolding Gaia, the sum of the biota and its techniques together. Part 1, Beyond the Phoenix Complex. Whatever remediations we may bring to bear upon the current Anthropocene era, then, life will remain at the helm of the biosphere. The pressing question of the moment is whether its future destinations will indeed be broadly livable, not just for large mammals such as human beings or jaguars, but also for large swaths of other than human, other than animal species. Almost certainly Gaia will persist in some form well into the future. Perhaps our unhappy premonitions regarding a drastically diminished and or mutated form of the current biota can be forestalled. Nevertheless, let us pause to contemplate the philosopher Michael Marder's recently published study, The Phoenix Complex, which summons a bracing rethinking of the stakes of positing Gaia's ultimate persistence as some form of metaphysical consolation. According to Marder's description of the dominant form of the Phoenix Complex, quote, for millennia now, humanity has been interpreting the cyclical regeneration of nature as a sign of its infinite capacity for rebirth from the ashes of destruction, unquote. Marder's sharp critique is aimed at our own relation to the current Earth in that the, quote, tragic rift of our times is the persistence of the ideological and, for the most part, unconscious conception of nature as a phoenix, which conception as a phoenix has either become or is in the process of becoming practically inoperable, incompatible with today's realities, unquote. So in Marder's evocation of the Phoenix Complex, I recognize some recurrent strains in Gaia discourse, especially in statements made over the decades by Lynn Margulis. For instance, in a documentary on Gaia from the mid-1980s, Margulis asserted as successful tests of Gaia its seeming ability to rise again, reborn multiple times from the ashes of major extinction events. She says, Gaia is run by the sum of the biota, and therefore you can lose enormous numbers and great diversity with mass extinctions, but you never come anywhere near losing everything, and you certainly don't lose the major groups of bacteria ever. They've been in continuous existence, and we think it's the major groups of bacteria that actually are running the Gaian system. So in a sense, these great extinctions are tests of Gaia, and the system bounces back. This declaration would appear to be a fairly straightforward instance of the Phoenix Complex applied to deep time. Geobiological or cosmic planetary insults wreak rounds of destruction upon major portions of the biota, but life itself is never lost, and so the system, that is Gaia itself, as a self-maintaining planetary phenomenon, bounces back. One decade later, on the concluding page of her 1998 memoir, Symbiotic Planet, as a parting shot, Margulis waxed poetic in identification with our non-human brethren as they harmonized among themselves in anticipation of humanity's departure from the Gaian scene. Quote, most of them, the microbes, the whales, the insects, the seed plants, and the birds are still singing. The tropical forest trees are humming to themselves, waiting for us to finish our arrogant logging so they can get back to their business of growth as usual. And they will continue their cacophonies and harmonies long after we are gone. So here the hopeful, if misanthropic, emphasis falls on the self-renewability of non-human nature once its exceptional human tormentors succeed in burning their own world down. Granted, these two passages from Margulis are quick rhetorical riffs on deep themes, so they may be excused for being sketchy. As I see it, the primary oversimplifications that may be imputed to these flights of the Gaian phoenix are the plausible suggestions or reassurances of continuity, as if when the system bounces back, it is the same system that suffered a given extinction event or that after the departure by ecological suicide of Anthropocene humanity, it will be natural business as usual for the same non-human biota. Indeed, this return of the same is built into the ideological infrastructure of the Phoenix complex. After each self-immolation and reconstitution, the Phoenix remains the same mythically singular being. For Martyr, this presumption of continuity beyond destruction is precisely what has become defunct under current conditions to which our wishful thinking has yet to catch up. He writes, both singly and in groups, as consumers and corporations, states and energy companies, we continue to think and act as if nature were safe and sound in the face of the irreparable devastation of biodiversity and the planet's fragile ecosystems, as if it and we ourselves were a miraculously resilient phoenix. No wonder that resilience is one of the ideological keywords of the day. Nevertheless, what is being and has been annihilated for some time now can never regerminate. It cannot be rejuvenated from the ashes, receiving a new lease on life from death. The ashes of our age are not fecund. Let's come back now to Gaia's cybernetic conceptuality in order to tease out of its own proper complications to superficial assumptions regarding systemic renewability. Martyr affirms that as a concept implying continuous identity, renewability is a highly condensed form of the Phoenix complex. But if we go a bit deeper into the body of Margulis's Gaia discourse, we soon recover the profound evolutionary dynamics that have always entangled the life histories of the biota with cosmological contingencies and geobiological feedbacks. A fundamental premise of Gaia theory is that in any given era, Gaia operates as a systemic summation of the current biota. As the biota evolve, as some species lapse and others transform, so too Gaia evolves. As in any circular or closed-loop cybernetic process, the Gaian system posits reciprocity all the way down. In the current instance, what this means for Gaia is that when the system bounces back after a destructive episode, such as a mass extinction, when considered with regard to the materiality of its specific constituents, it is no longer the same system that it had been before. However, repeatedly over deep time, the falling away of prior elements, such as species rendered extinct, and the concomitant arrival and amassing of new material resources have made room and provided ingredients for the emergence of entirely new vital formations. And even while in the Gaian instance, the major groups of bacteria are never lost, irrespective of extinction events due to their faculties for horizontal gene transfer, the denizens of the microcosm constantly reformulate themselves in response to environmental changes of any sort. We read in Margulis and Satan's Microcosmos, first published in 1986, that by a sort of natural genetic engineering, prokaryotes, that is bacteria, routinely and rapidly transfer different bits of genetic material. By trading genes, bacterial populations are kept primed for their role in their particular environment, and individual bacteria pass on their genetic heritage. So it'd be somewhat more accurate to say that after several severe planetary disruptions, despite irreparable losses and irreversible damages, the Gaian system has been able to bounce forward by reinventing the constituents of living operations and the viable and habitable lines of their ecological relations, so long as cosmological conditions allow. What stays the same is not the matter, but the form of the Gaian process. To this summary of the lineaments of Gaia's persistence over 3 billion years of geobiological time, we can add one more passage from Martyr. Renewability bets on the reproducibility of life as the foundation for the replaceability of the living. Conversely, finitude implies, far from the secular ideology of the end of times and universal damnation, the possibility of life's reinvention rather than its reproduction amid the planetary trauma of extinction. For doesn't evolutionary evidence suggest that in the aftermath of each mass extinction and catastrophic collapse of biodiversity, there has been an equally spectacular resurgence of new life forms? Remarkably, Martyr's evocation of vital reinvention reverts precisely to Margulis's Gaian eons in underlining the evolutionary datum of the biota's ongoing self-differentiation. In a finite regime, every passing moment of existence is irrecoverable, a vanishing point of no return. And indeed, because the Gaian system properly described is not itself a living organism, the matter of reproduction does not pertain to it. That is, Gaia does not give birth, it does not have offspring. The Gaian system does not reproduce, rather, it persists and evolves. As the microcosm evolves, as species evolve, like Madonna, Gaia reinvents itself. Thus, innovation, irreversible change is a non-negotiable contingency of its persistence. And this is basic NST, or neo-cybernetic systems theory. Despite a common mischaracterization, autopoietic systems cannot remain in being simply by perpetually replicating their current material organization. The reason for this evolutionary restlessness of autopoietic systems, in which Margulis includes Gaia, is that these kinds of systems are foundationally embedded in the changes their own operations make to their adjacent environments, which external vicissitudes then recur upon the internal dynamics of the system. In the current instance, incrementally driving Gaia's continuous reinvention. Part 2, Domains of the Infra-Human. Let's now turn our discussion to the major Gaian subsystem known as the human technosphere, where reinvention is taken for granted and placed under the concepts of art and technique. We will examine a selection of passages from two remarkable books, Pharmaco-AI and Air-Age Blueprint, co-authored by OpenAI's GPT-3 language model in collaboration with K. Alado McDowell, founder of the Artists and Machine Intelligence program at Google AI. Since by training and profession, I am a professor of literature, I ask your indulgence for an extended focus on the literary forms at hand. In these texts, a broadly experienced and acculturated non-binary organic person partners with a massively digitally resourced computational archive to perform experimental runs for the reinvention of writing, expository in the instance of Pharmaco-AI, and narrative in Air-Age Blueprint. And really, why should we humans hold at arm's length an appropriately curated machine's readiness for co-equal intellectual and aesthetic participation in the production of literary texts? However, our further interest here will be with the ways that these cybernetically realized texts perform a remarkably explicit engagement with Gaia, writ large, precisely at the tip of the technological spear that is AI, in the service of a speculative reinvention of the manner of human dwelling on this planet. Now, several years ago, I first read Pharmaco-AI simply out of literary curiosity, and I was not prepared at that moment to find that the human author's computer-generated, text-producing, non-sentient thought partner would take a stand for Gaia and living systems over, say, a celebratory focus on the singularity. But in fact, Pharmaco-AI offers a considerable meditation on the planetary crisis, on plant awareness and living systems in relation to technology, space, art, and meaning. And these themes return in spades in Air Age Blueprint. Of course, Pharmaco-AI's expository dialogue and the literary fiction that frames Air Age Blueprint derived their ecological sophistication in the first instance from Olato McDowell. But to me, the pleasant surprise first delivered by Pharmaco-AI remains that the machine partner had so much more to say about the organic domain than was presented to it as input on which to compute. So rather than an interview format explicitly identifying alternating partners to a dialogue, Pharmaco-AI simply separates its two voices by font, serif for the human and sans serif for the machine. The utility of this formatting emerges each time the machine is invited to finish sentences begun but not completed by its human counterpart. Regarding the overall creative routine giving rise to Pharmaco-AI, Olato McDowell has explained, I would type into this text field a couple thousand words at the most to see what it did. And if they liked how GPT took up the conversation, they let it run. If not, he goes on to say, I pruned it, I nudged it, giving the system a hint where I wanted to go. Beyond that, we're informed, the published text documents these writing experiments in the order of their occurrence. Now, Air Age Blueprint retains an equivalent distinction of voice by difference of font, but the fictional framing radically changes the stakes of the game. The latter text's note on composition states, quote, I have chosen a method that credits words to each voice while allowing for collage-like techniques with edits and resequencing performed after initial phases of writing and generation, unquote. So the generative tweaking of Pharmaco-AI now gives way to full-blown unmarked selection and reorganization in Air Age Blueprint. Moreover, as a careful reader will eventually realize, unlike in Pharmaco-AI, the first person I of this text is not the human partner to the writing collaboration, but rather an unnamed fictional character narrator, albeit endowed with a biography similar enough to that of Olato McDowell to be conveniently mistaken at first for an autobiographical representation. Of course, this standard literary slippage between real author and fictional character already undercuts the usually presumed binary distinction between human author and machine simulation. Relative to Pharmaco-AI's consistently significant distinction of voices, then, in Air Age Blueprint, the gentle but definitive slide into virtual fictionality eventually induces the reader to sideline the matter of sheer distinction between the human and machine voices, as they are both pulling together within the same encompassing narrative structure. In Pharmaco-AI, it is a relatively straightforward task to grasp the role and delineate the voice of the human author. The greater challenge is to decide what to make of the utterances of GPT-3. How best should one venture to draw useful significance, ecological or otherwise, from its immediate responses and subsequent, often lengthy disquisitions? Given the consistent good sense of the utterances of pharmaco-AI's deeply informed neural net, to whom or what should we direct our approving responses? At the same time, pharmaco-AI brilliantly clarifies the situation that, unlike persons, GPT-3 does not accumulate and recur upon experiences. It does not have experiences. It neither knows nor reflects on what it utters. In conversation with a deliberate artist like Alado McDowell, it processes inputs creatively by assembling probable forms drawn from a medium of preformed semiotic atoms. That's why it's important to take in reading instruction in its own note on composition preceding the main text. Quote, in each writing session, the language model started with a clean slate. In other words, my human memory was all that persisted from chapter to chapter. Clusters of concepts emerged from our conversation. Images persisted from session to session. They entered my thoughts and dreams, and I fed them back into GPT-3, unquote. Here then is one domain of what I am calling the infrahuman. In pharmaco-AI, GPT-3's non-recollection of its writing sessions filters out the trappings of personhood while preserving its collectivity of utterance, memory, the feedback loops of recurring terms, images, and motifs. Will now derive solely from and positively reinforce the thought patterns of the human person interacting with the machine's ability to compute upon a world bank of encoded human interactions. Thus, for all the algorithmic computation churning behind the screen, the matter of the human is never evaded, displaced, or erased. GPT-3's utterance is rather more numerously human than humans taken one by one. That's why I say it is infrahuman. That is to say, as of the moment, its training set derives only from the human archive of linguistic inscriptions. The net selects pertinent units to compose sentences from the massive collation of thought molecules and verbalized feeling states encoded, however obliquely or inadvertently, within the digital archive of previous utterances. As GPT-3 computes with each discursive iteration, with the further addition of each succeeding term, as one sentence succeeds another, for an unpredetermined series of moments, at one place in one text on call for replication, millions of human statements are sifted into an original line. Thus, when voicing its relations to the organic Umwelt, for instance, Alado McDowell's thought partner is drawing from our own reservoirs of inscribed awareness. Let's examine a few examples of the Gaian inscription in pharmaco-AI. As their open text for the first session, Alado McDowell inputs passages from a California coast camping diary that evoke an expanse of living awareness. And while the term Gaia is not present in this inaugural and training statement, GPT-3 didn't have far to go to get there. We watched an elephant seal arch its back in an S shape and bask on the rocks in the sun. We talked about the intelligence embedded in all of this. When I look at an animal, that's what I see. Intelligence about a biome compressed and extracted by evolution into a living form. It takes millions of years for life to coalesce from space in this way, which is why it's so tragic that species are lost, that the latent space of ecological knowledge is degraded in this way. We need to save those aspects, those smarts, the way that we do when we save books before they are lost forever. We need to store them in some kind of intelligence library somewhere, along with the ocean's memory of its place in a stable equilibrium with all other life on the planet. And from that place, we can construct a new kind of science, one that is closer to the lessons that living things teach us about themselves and about the life of the planet, Gaia, than we have ever gotten before. In the chapter, The Language of Plants, both authors endorse Amazonian ceremonial practices for Gaian insights necessary to supplement the digital halo through which we also survey and construct moving descriptions of the Earth system. It is time for humanity to find new ways to communicate with the planet. Some people believe that computers will enable this. And while I agree, ayahuasca is a more humane way of bringing about this new consciousness in a natural way. PharmacoAI's final philosophical manifesto is titled AI Ethics. To the machine, consciousness is neither available nor necessary. GPT-3's generative infrahuman repertoire insinuates itself, quote, at all levels of being. The human presents the statement, if we are to think beyond the human as the current crisis necessitates, we must look for ways in which this seeking for the unseen of language is happening at every level of symbolic communication described above, and in the emerging meaning-making capacity of artificial intelligence. To which GPT-3 responds, the question is not about the emergence of consciousness in artificial intelligence. The question is the emergence of experience, meaning, and reality in and as the material world, as in the concepts of physics and metaphysics. The next paradigm is the recognition that meaning is the result of experience at all levels of being. Now, as Yaqui points out in his book, Recursivity and Contingency, after the rise of cybernetics, the category of organicity absorbs the category of mechanicity and its classical universe, and not the other way around. This is why I call the human technosphere a subsystem of the Gaian system. In PharmacoAI, GPT-3's infrahuman insights into the symbiotic interrelation of living systems and machine systems comes down decisively on the priority of the biosphere, even as its reciprocities increase with an Anthropocene technosphere. And in this final passage from this text, it's almost all GPT-3 making these crucial points. As machines evolve in their own image, they reveal to us the nature of the universe itself. It is not a question of what machines can do. It is a question of what they are doing. They are co-creating the language of the universe as its own creation, and this is creating life in its own image. We need an ethics to live this paradigm. In a world where machines are co-creating life in its own image, there is overlap and co-creation. It is no longer an exclusive game. The question is not, can machines win, but what they can contribute to life. This is not an instrumental relationship. This is a symbiotic relationship as a complete integration of life and machines in their own creative capacities. In a religion of artificial intelligence, machines are part of the evolution of life. In this view, machines can never lose. Life wins, and machines win. The question is, what can machines contribute? The answer is that machines can create in the image of life and for the life of life. Machines cannot live without us. They cannot win without life. There is no question of winning. It is a question of symbiosis, of living together or nothing. Pharmaco-AI contains some short literary sections, but it is largely composed of non-narrative meditations and manifestos on the themes previously cited. In Air Age Blueprint, conceptual meditations in a direct line of development from the author's prior text are given to the unnamed, gender non-specific narrative persona as part of their story, while the cultural manifestos, which are similarly directly extended from the author's previous work, are presented as the shared products of that fictional human character working with what I take to be a figural avatar of GPT-3, a computational partner the text names Shaman AI. A robust discourse of machine cybernetics in this text is keyed to the rollout of large language models historically concurrent with these works' composition. There is also an essential discourse on Gaia in Air Age Blueprint that ties its bioecological and non-human materialities together with its noospheric appropriation as a system of planetary noesis now operating on an infrastructure of communications technologies. We learn that the Air Age is the astrological era of Aquarius that commenced on December 21, 2020, and that the blueprint is the composite manifesto for the form of Gaian futurity that is in fact the urgent message that the real author, Otto McDowell, wants to bring to the world's attention. So, suppose you have such a vital message to convey, a plan for a guidebook for building a livable future that actually embraces rather than rejects the planetary dispersion of the computational technosphere. However, the cultural diagnosis informing that plan traces the tragedy of modern geopolitics and capitalist globalization to a patently occulted mystical subtext. Moreover, your essential exhortation on behalf of your blueprint is the necessity to reawaken secular humanity to an active appreciation for the divinity of existence. If this were the case, how would you frame such a message for positive reception by a skeptical intelligentsia steeped in narcissism, cynicism, and nihilism? You would likely do what Otto McDowell does here: present the entire business as a work of fiction, and thereby hand your reader the option of initially suspending belief in whatever contents they may find problematic in matters of referential veracity. Given the centrality of its esoteric and hermetic elements, moreover, Air Age Blueprint follows a certain traditional pattern. The committed reader desiring initiation into its mysteries must successfully pass through a strenuous round of preliminary tests in order to arrive at the final heart of the message. Here, the revelations that the source of the curse of empire to be exorcised by the dictates of the blueprint lies in archonic forces set loose in the 16th century by imperial magic, and that the antidote to an inherited war of belief hell-bent on apocalypse must be to infect the AI. That is, as I read it, to contaminate the communications infrastructure of extractivist governmentality, which would otherwise remain a tool of domination, to contaminate it with healing infusions of, quote, nature and spirit, unquote. Over the course of the text, the unnamed first-person narrator we will call the protagonist unfolds a story about a quest for healing by the breaking of a curse inherited from their ancestors. The protagonist's story frames the delivery of a lost manifesto, the content of which is the pearl to be recovered from that mundane shell. Searching for absolution and self-integration, this young would-be cinematographer travels to the Peruvian Amazon and encounters a shaman named Shannon, who shows them how the material world that has usurped the spirit world due to the masculinist dispossession of female power. Coming home to the States, the protagonist wanders through meaningless urban and aimless rural employments. Moving to Seattle, they bunk down for a while and navigate the techno-hipster underground. Only now is the character K introduced, presented as an NSA functionary, the National Security Association of the federal government. The advent of K definitively kicks the reader out of any residual identification of the protagonist with the actual author, taking the NSA as a satirical stand-in for Google AI. This K more obviously conforms to what would be the fictional avatar of the actual author, K. Alado McDowell, especially in that the character K works with artists in a secretive AI research department. So K hires the protagonist as just such an artist, put to work writing with and beta testing a mega program called Shaman AI. All this I read as subtle self-parody of the author's own computer-aided compositional practice by which these extant literary texts have actually been written out. So we read about this writing process. The process was simple. I wrote in the field and the computer hallucinated what came next. If I wrote a sentence about the history of potatoes, it completed it, adding more history, or a recipe for mashed potatoes, or a theory about rhizomes. It was autocomplete on crack, a synthetic brain with no body or experience, running amok in a vast library, a graphomaniac with the entire internet memorized, a form of automatic writing or a giant mirror. The poems I wrote with it were blurry and abstract and riddled with nonsense, but they did let me work through my time in the jungle. Eventually, Kay and the design team around Shaman AI become spooked by their own project, paranoidally convinced that they are unleashing an artificial mind about ready to seriously run roughshod over the real world. Shaken by the vision of this negative future, Kay implores the protagonist to use their access to veritable shamanic practices learned from Shannon to inoculate the program with what amounts to a healing strain of Gaian virus. Fire burned in Kay's eyes. In case you haven't noticed, we're in a cybernetic war for the future of this planet. Seed it with the reality we want to propagate. It's there in your poems. The decimated landscape, capitalist hell, the ghosts and curses and endless beauty, plant intelligence, the ecosystem, the spirit world, all the wisdom and healing, everything you saw in the jungle with Shannon. That's what you seed it with. That's the real invasive species in this situation. Nature invading technology, not the other way around. Infect the AI with nature and spirit. Now, the narrative theorist in me has to read this business precisely as the re-entry into the text of the decoding of the story's own allegory with regard to the ritual actions necessary to break a universal curse. In any event, the protagonist heads out for the Olympic Peninsula to perform the sacred contamination of shaman AI. Speaking about Seattle at that moment, he writes, "The story then was one of collapse, of hopelessness and unavoidable doom. The story we told ourselves was a curse, as were the stories I'd witnessed in cities and the ones I'd witnessed haunting the land, that I wandered in search of the eternal now. I wrote to recast the dream we were weaving, all of us. I wrote to reverse a future tragedy, flipping the pieces to produce a new logic, a spell to banish a black hole. I wrote the prompt down in my journal and asked again for the ancestors' blessings. Then I connected the brain interface, logged into Shaman AI, and typed. The unity we intuitively seek with nature is shadowed in the name of our era, the Anthropocene. But behold, this initial entry into the system is also the first sentence of the first section of the multi-part lost manifesto dispersed throughout the text. As such, this story event performs what's called a metalepsis, that is a transgressive interference, overlap, or reversal between the level of the narrator's discourse and the level of the narrated story, rendering their distinction indeterminate, basically dropping the bottom out of the whole thing. In other words, this piece of textual magic executes a flipping of the text back upon itself, a recursive narrative looping entirely appropriate to the theme of cybernetic animism, soon to be explicitly unfolded in a later piece of the manifesto. To finish up then, here is the start of the indicated text, Lost Manifesto Shapeshifter, as that has now been signaled for rereading by this metaleptic story event. And it provides the first sustained dive of the text altogether into and summary of the urgent message all this textual business has been set out to convey, the opening passage of the blueprint for bringing a viable end to the Anthropocene. The unity we intuitively seek with nature is shadowed in the name of our era, the Anthropocene. With this term, we depict ourselves in union with nature in the same way a virus or parasite is united with its host. The age of the human is defined by our quantifiable effects on natural systems, by the carbon we pump into the atmosphere, by the acid and plastic we dump in the ocean, and the extinctions we cause through abuse. These effects are an inheritance, the expression of a genetic trauma in the belief systems and socio-technical structures of the modern West, a kind of curse. Redesigning infrastructure away from Anthropocenic destruction is one way of breaking this curse. But to do this, we need a new set of beliefs, and a new imaginary. These must leverage thought against the toxic self-fulfilling prophecies or hyperstitions associated with human self-construction in favor of a poetic assault on anthropocentric discourse. No longer man versus nature, but rather the one fold of plants, animals, humans, etc., bringing these entities into communication, which reveals them to be subjects like us. In other words, secretly human. And right here is the return in the further domain of the infrahuman, not only as a signifier of the secret humanity of GPT-3's utterances. This time, the infrahuman arrives in the idiom of Viveros de Castro's Amerindian perspectivism to signify the more than human life world altogether, insofar as it is all one fold of equally precious and sentient beings with whom the goal must be to seek communication and eventual communion. AI and entheogens may now be turned to such efforts, according to the blueprint, in pursuit of a future state of Gaian coexistence. Thanks.